Welcome to another History Mystery. I'm Mimi, and as fall has set in and winter soon approaches, I feel drawn to some of the cozier items in our collections. Things like fuzzy sweaters, well-worn socks, and patched-up blankets. One of my favorite items is a certain quilt on loan to the museum. Let's take a look. Now, the quilt itself is not terribly exciting. Looking at it, it's just a bunch of little rectangles in muted colors on a faded pinky-red lining. But the fun part is a little note that came attached to the quilt that reads as follows. This quilt was made from the scraps of men's suits by Virginia Lane Groover, wife of Confederate soldier James Abner Groover. Well, we're off to an already interesting start now that we know these itchy little rectangles are suit scraps. But the rest of the story gets even more interesting. Groover was taken prisoner of war in Fairfax, Virginia, and imprisoned at Camp Lookout, Maryland. After the war ended, he walked from the prison camp to the community of Grooverville, Georgia. Now that's pretty impressive. There are all sorts of new questions now. First off, how did he manage to walk all the way from Virginia to Georgia? And where is Grooverville? And how did this quilt end up with us? Let's start with the Grooverville question. Now, if you are from this area, you may know about Grooverville, but for those who don't, let's go back a little and find out about this place. Present-day Grooverville is an unincorporated town located in Brooks County, near the border with Thomas County. But it wasn't always this way. If we look back nearly 200 years ago, before Brooks County, even before Thomas County, this area was a little different. Let's go back. After Europeans arrived in the Americas, they began claiming territory all along the eastern coast of North America. Down here, the Spanish controlled the land, then the British, and then the Spanish. It went back and forth a bit. Of course, in the middle of all this land grabbing are the original inhabitants of this area, the various Native American groups that had lived here for time immemorial. As much as the Europeans claimed the land, they actually had very little control beyond the areas they physically settled in. In the area that became South Georgia, the original inhabitants continued their lives as they were accustomed. They managed the land, using controlled burning to nurture the longleaf and wiregrass forests that spread throughout the region, providing valuable hunting land, while also farming and living along the occasional springs and creeks that pop up throughout the area. But this way of life forever changed in the 19th century. In 1814, the newly formed United States of America was battling out the last days of the War of 1812. In their efforts to kick the British out, the American army traveled south, and kicked out everyone else along the way. After the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which saw the American forces team up with the faction from the Creek Nation to defeat the British, who teamed up with another Creek faction, the United States government signed a contract with their ally, the Creek National Council, known as the Treaty of Fort Jackson. This treaty blamed the entire Creek Nation for the actions of the faction that sided with the British. As punishment, the United States confiscated roughly 5.1 million acres of land from the Creek. Naturally, the Creek were not thrilled with this new setup, but the United States government loved their new territory that gave them access to the Gulf of Mexico and acted as a buffer between the Creek in Middle Georgia and the Spanish and the British down in Florida. Over the ensuing years, the new land in what was now southwest Georgia was divided up into 3 counties: Irwin, Early, and Appling. By the 1820s, the counties were carved up a little more, creating Thomas County, which covered a lot more area than it does today. At this point, American settlers were coming in and starting up new communities, including a little outcrop along the Coffee Road. That's the 1820s major highway of South Georgia. This little place was given the catchy nickname of Station Number 18, or sometimes Key. Some of the first Americans to settle in Key were the James Groover family. Now you can see where the name Grooverville came from. But that wouldn't take place for a few more years. In fact, we don't have an exact date for when the name changed, but by the end of the antebellum period, the town of Grooverville was reaching its peak. In 1856, Malachi Groover mapped out his family's land into lots, which became the town of Grooverville. At this point, the town already had a few stores, 2 churches, a post office, the third to be built in the county, a Masonic lodge, 2 doctors' offices, a blacksmith shop, and its own school, covering students from childhood to near adulthood. Most residents lived on farms, or very large plantations alongside a growing population of enslaved workers. But the boom times wouldn't last forever. In 1858, parts of Thomas and Lowndes County were broken off to create Brooks County, taking Grooverville with it. In December of 1859, Grooverville was officially incorporated as a town, just in time for the dawn of a little thing called the American Civil War. After the war, the agrarian-based settlement was pretty well sunk. Big-time plantation owners like Moses Linton tried to sell their property to earn some money, but there were no buyers. Confederate money was worthless, and the formerly enslaved workers were now free, but with no money or supplies to live on. The area suffered an economic depression from which it never quite recovered. This puts us in the time of our Quilt story. James Abner Groover, born in 1839, was a member of the rather extensive Groover family that settled in Grooverville. His father's farm was sizable, thanks in large part to the 16 enslaved laborers who worked on the property. Groover probably attended the Grooverville Academy for his education before attending college, like many young men of his time and social standing. In 1862, he joined Company K of the 50th Infantry of Georgia, also known as the Brooks County Sons. He mustered in as a 4th corporal, just above your average Joe private, but over time, and due to the death and major injuries faced by his commanding officers, rose to the rank of sergeant. Unlike most of his fellow Brooks County Sons, Groover survived the war relatively unscathed. Now, I did mention earlier that he spent time imprisoned. On April 6, 1865, he was captured at Harper's Farm, Virginia. 3 days later, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered. Even though the war was over, Groover had been shipped up to Point Lookout in Maryland, one of the largest and worst Union-run prisoners of war camps. Groover wasn't released until June 4th. At that point, he began to walk home. The distance from Point Lookout to Grooverville is roughly 800 miles. If he walked without stopping, it would have taken him 11.5 days to make it home. Naturally, he probably took some breaks along the way. If we guess that he walked about 12 hours a day, that trip would have taken him a little over 23 days. At least Forrest Gump had proper tennis shoes when he ran across the country. After returning home and hopefully taking some time to rest, Groover resumed his family's work on the farm. In 1868, he married his distant cousin, genealogically, not geographically, Virginia Lane Groover. The couple had 6 children, 5 of whom survived to adulthood. It was Virginia who used her family's worn-out clothes to make the simple yet beautiful brick path pattern quilt we have at the museum today. And why is a quilt from Brooks County in a museum about neighboring Thomas County? Well, technically James and Virginia Groover were born and raised in Thomas County until the 1858 division. And some of their children moved back over the border into the town of Boston. But their descendant, a granddaughter named Sarah Everett Marjorie Bell, gave the quilt to her local chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who loaned it to the museum. Here we keep it in our collections, where it remains a piece of an interesting, and like a brick path sometimes winding, history of our area. If this video interested you, be sure to check out our website and social media, where you can find more stories and items like these. Let us know in the comments what you want to hear about. Be sure to leave us a like on this video, and as always, thanks for watching!